예, 보시다시피 지금 빌 바우에 선생님이 저 암스테르담에서 발표를 하시고 PPT 자료를 활용하실 겁니다. 잘 한번 보시죠.
Greetings. My name is Bill Baue, and I am Senior Director with R3.0. We are an organization, a global common good, not-for-profit. We started out our life as Reporting 3.0, looking at a third generation of the development of reporting towards a green and inclusive and open economy. Or we often will also call it a regenerative and distributive economy, drawing on the work of Kate Raworth. And we have since transformed our name to R3.0 because our scope is much broader than reporting. So it now stands for redesigned for resilience and regeneration. And I'm very glad to be speaking today at the first Global Commons Forum. I'm speaking to you from the Netherlands, where I have a meeting about one of the initiatives that I'll be talking about at the end of this talk. But what I've been asked to speak about by Michelle Bouwens, one of the main organizers of this event, is the notion of bioregional accounting for regeneration within thermodynamics and ethics of Doughnut thresholds. So that's a lot of jargon, a lot of words that we need to unpack. So that's what I will be bringing you through in the next 20 to 25 minutes. If there are questions, I'm glad to take them in real time if people want to, or we can wait until the end of the presentation for questions. I'm glad to go either way on that. So I will start, if my computer will abide. Okay, so just setting the groundwork, R3.0 as a global common good, one of the things that we do is generate so-called blueprints. And these are areas where we believe that there is a gap between existing practice and even existing levels of ambition on the one hand, and what would be needed for a regenerative and distributive economy to emerge. And so we've done that. We started with 4 areas of inquiry where we pulled together working groups of between 20 and 40 global experts and took them through a couple of rounds of exposure drafts to review the recommendations that we were coming up with for moving that field to what we would say is necessary in order to bring about a new economic design. And so 2 of the areas that I'm just going to point to briefly, and you can find this work on our website, which is r3-o.org. We've got it listed at the bottom, and I hope that my presentation will be available to share after this event. It's all open source, so glad to share it with you. The first that I'll point to is an accounting blueprint. So this is about 100-page report that we put together, where the main thing that I'll point to for this, for the purposes of this presentation, is the idea that right now the field of accounting is fragmented between 3 primary ways of accounting. Management accounting is internal to the organization. Financial accounting tends to be external to the organization, and in particular oriented towards investment. And then sustainability accounting is separate from both of those and even fragmented amongst itself. There is not a disciplined understanding of what sustainability accounting is, although we at R3.0 and our partners have a very clear understanding of what we take sustainability accounting to be, and I'll share a little bit more about that now. But the point here is that we have articulated a different way of of doing accounting than is performed right now, and that's contained in the accounting blueprint. And I would even say that what I'm presenting to you today even goes beyond what we have contained in the accounting blueprint. So I'm presenting ideas that go even further than the foundation that we set here. The next thing that I'll point to is our data blueprint. That one, I was the primary author of it, so I'm quite familiar with it. And what I'm presenting on the my right, is what we call the data integral data flow chart, which is what we believe the data points that would be needed and the flow of data that would be needed to track actual sustainability or regenerativity within an organization or a region, if you will. So given the bioregional focus, this is what we believe would be needed. And I'll just touch on a couple of things quickly. One is that the inputs of data would need to come from the micro level, which we define as the organizational level. The meso level would be either a corporate sector or industry, or an investment portfolio, or in the geopolitical sense, a habitat, or you might call it a bioregion. The macro level would be the ecological systems level, or the social systems level, or the economic systems level. Right now, we tend to have data inputs that are just focusing on one of those levels and not with the integration of all three of those levels. Furthermore, the multiple capitals. Capital theory has evolved to not just look at financial capital, but any stocks and flows of productive resources. So natural capital, like ecological ecosystem services, for example, social capital, human capital, etc. So we believe that all of the capitals, the resources, need to be measured. And then finally, we believe that this internal, so data internal to an organization needs to be merged, data that's external to an organization, and you need to look at the thresholds of resource stocks, or the viability of a resource to sustain itself going forward. And the allocations are the amount of a resource that could be used by any one organization. So it's basically drawing on the notion of the limits to growth report from the Club of Rome from 1972. It's that line of thinking that we're tapping into. So that's what we believe is a new version of data that would be needed for the kind of accounting that we're talking about. So that just sets the foundation of core R3.0 thinking on the accounting and the data front. I'm now going to step back to say a little bit more about this notion of thresholds and allocations. It's a key issue in our work. And in fact, it's a concept that's been picked up by some of the work that I will present later. And the easiest way to do this is through a couple of metaphors based on food. So on my left, you'll see a donut, and on the right is a pie. And those two are metaphors that I will walk you through for the notion of thresholds and allocations. So the donut is a metaphor for thresholds, or what we call inner and outer limits. And that's an idea that was first proposed in 1974 at a UNEP, United Nations Environment Program meeting called the Koyukuk Declaration. And a woman named Barbara Ward proposed that we have outer limits, which are also considered ecological ceilings. So that would be, for example, the amount of carbon that we as humanity can afford to emit that can be assimilated, that the earth can absorb back and keep in balance. Of course, we know that we are wildly out of balance right now on the climate front. Another example would be water. There's only a certain amount of water in a watershed, and as we know from the example of Cape Town in South Africa, it almost experienced a day zero where it ran out of water. On the inner side, the inner limits are what Kate Raworth in her Doughnut economics book calls social foundations. So those are the foundation. It's a lower limit of social cohesion and resources that need to be provided for basic subsistence needs. We want to be above the social foundations and below the ecological ceilings. So this is based on work starting in 2009 on the planetary boundaries on the left, coming from the Stockholm Resilience Center. They were the first to articulate the kind of ecological ceilings based on a robust body of scientific data. And then Kate Raworth in her Doughnut economics book added the social foundations to get the notion of a donut. So those are the idea of thresholds. So they're basically limits that we need to respect, both on the outer and inner side of things. Next, we go to allocations, or slices of the pie. So a resource could be considered one pie, and the amount that any given individual or an organization would be able to use its fair share, if you will. And if you've ever been splitting up a pie, you know that some people need bigger slices, some people prefer smaller slices, but everyone needs to get a slice of the pie, and it needs to be fair. So on the right is the notion of how one would do that with water, and I'll give you a deeper look at that. This is an idea of how water would be shared in a watershed, where you have to take account of the natural uses of water. So, for example, evapotranspiration, that's just the world. Water evaporates, and that needs to be taken into account. And then there are natural systems uses of water that need to be taken into account. And then there's basic human consumption of water that needs to be taken into account, the human right to water. So it's only when we get down to the bottom of this water drop that you can see the amount of water that could be allocated to any given organization. And so you need to take what in the scientific term is seen as a mass balancing approach. You have to look at the whole pie, if you will, and allocate to individual organizations. So that's the core idea of thresholds and allocations that is at the foundation of our work at R3.0, and I'll tell you a little bit more about what we're doing with that. But I'm just going to run through a quick history of how that is applied in organizations. So this is the Global Reporting Initiative. That is the gold standard for organizational sustainability reporting. This that you're looking at is the 2002, just get all those up there. This is the second generation of sustainability reporting guidelines that the GRI introduced in 2002. And it calls for making the link between the micro level that I mentioned earlier, the individual organization's sustainability performance, and the macro level, their impact on the macro systems, the ecological, social, and economic systems. And importantly, it said sustainability reporting, or even sustainability accounting for that matter, draws significant meaning from the larger context of how performance at the organizational level affects economic, environmental, and social capital formation, and again, this is multiple capital, and depletion at local, regional, or global level. So reporting organizations should consider their individual performance, that's the allocation, in the context of economic, environmental, and social sustainability. And this will involve discussing, this is the key bit, performance of the organization in the context of the limits and demands placed on economic, environmental, and social resources at the macro level. So what we have in that sense is essentially the thresholds and the allocations in one sentence. So that's what the GRI says. This principle still resides in the GRI standards. But if we look here, this is a picture of how it's actually being implemented. And this is from a 2017 study by Danish academics. And the graphic is actually from an UNRIS, United Nations Research Institute on Social Development report that I recently authored, and it's coming out hopefully later this week. So we'll be able to share this resource. The large red bubble is 40,000 corporate responsibility reports that came out between 2000 and 2013. The small shaded bubble is 5% of those reports that even mention the notion of ecological limits, and the tiny dot is those reports, 0.258%, that actually integrate those limits into their product development or corporate strategy. So the point here is that 99.7% of so-called sustainability reports are not reporting on sustainability because they completely ignore thresholds. And that's just looking at ecological thresholds. So essentially we are flying blind when it comes to the sustainability of organizations in the world. And this is of utmost importance. We have here Alan White, who was a co-founder of the Global Reporting Initiative, who says that sustainability requires contextualization within its thresholds. That's what sustainability is all about, and yet we rarely see it. It's time to get serious about context in light of the ecological and social perils that lie ahead, or I would argue that are upon us. So the time for procrastination is past, the time for aggressive movement is upon us, is what Alan says, and that's from a 2013 interview I did with him. To give you a notion of how to apply this is the idea of the sustainability quotient. This is from Mark McElroy's PhD thesis, which he further built out in his book called Corporate Sustainability Management. This notion that sustainability S equals A over N, so sustainability equals actual impacts on the numerator over normative impacts, or what those impacts would need to be on the broader system in order to be sustainable. So it's impacts on the carrying capacities of vital capital resources. So this introduces this notion of a carrying capacity, which we see here. That's an idea that was first introduced in the 1800s in the UK, and then ultimately globally by a man named Plimsoll. This was introduced in the shipping industry, where due to the desire for profit, shipping companies would simply load up their boats as full as they possibly could. They'd get out to sea and they would sink. So thousands of workers were dying from this kind of overload of boats, and Plimsoll saw that a boat can only carry a certain amount of capacity without sinking. And so the Plimsoll line is now an international standard. You'll see it on all shipping boats on the side of them to mark the line between sustainability and unsustainability, essentially, between floating and sinking. And that's the very idea that we use with carrying capacities. Now I'm going to apply this idea to the bioregional level. And bioregional is essentially the idea that a region is defined by how natural resources flow, natural and cultural resources flow in that region, not by the kinds of artificial boundaries that we have imposed politically more recently. And so this is what I'm showing you is a paper, a pilot study on bioregionalism that was performed by one of our partners, James Quilligan from the Peer-to-Peer Foundation, the organization that Michelle Bowens is with. James also works with economic democracy advocates, and this is the report. I'm just showing you the cover of it, but essentially he was looking at applying the studying the agricultural sustainability of the San Francisco Bay watershed. So a bioregion of San Francisco, can it feed itself with the agricultural resources that it has, so the thresholds of resources compared to the allocations, allocating those resources to the population base. And in a companion paper that you'll see on the right, James presented this at our conference in 2018 at KPMG, and I'm going to run you through a couple of the ideas of that. This is where he's applying a thermodynamic approach to the idea of carrying capacity. And what he pointed to, and I'm running through this very quickly, I can share the paper itself for people who want to look in greater depth. Essentially what he said is that the first two laws of thermodynamics of the conservation of energy and the idea of entropy have been applied to sustainability, but what we've been missing is the application of the third law, or centropy, which basically says that no system can be without energy. What he essentially says is that it is, if you translate the third law of thermodynamics, it's really about cooperation. And in the application that he's using it, it's a cooperation or a balance between the resources that are available, which you'll see on the chart on the right, and the size of the population. And the line that you see, the blue line, is essentially the threshold of making sure that you have the resources available for the population size, and that's what you can apply, and that's what he does apply on a bioregional basis. So this is just where he introduced the notion of carrying capacity, and that in order to meet our needs within the idea that energy cannot be created or destroyed, he's looking at pounds and calories, other words, of the food that can be created in a region. There's a thermodynamic limit to that. And then the idea of entropy, that he's interpreting that as moving from just sufficiency to well-being. How can we create well-being within the laws of entropy? And it's the bottom of the triangle that we're looking for. He's noticing that the material resources produced and distributed need to satisfy everyone's needs, or that the biological rate of growth or of use of resources has to meet the social metabolism, or the rate at which people need food. And that, so that's the idea that is presented by Quilligan in this series of papers. In essence, what we're saying is that on a bioregional level, we need to calculate how much resource a region can generate and compare it to the population that needs to be fed. I'm just pointing out here some resources. These are three that are produced by the Peer-to-Peer Foundation. So this is for further research that you can look into. One is the P2P Accounting for Planetary Survival. So this is where Michelle goes into more depth around the idea of accounting within the Doughnut thresholds, if you will. And then these other two papers are further papers on applying thermodynamics to the question of sustainability, and James Quilligan wrote the foreword for both of those. So those are linked in the presentation that I can send you. I'm just going to note a couple of them here from the book, the Peer-to-Peer Accounting for Planetary Survival. One is the notion of resources, events, and agents as a new kind of accounting mechanism. and that's one that the outfit Commons Engine, which is a division, if you will, of Holochain. So that's a distributed ledger technology or blockchain application of accounting that essentially applies some of the concepts that we've been talking about here. And I can share contact information if wanted with folks there. And then finally, Regen Network, who you heard from their founder, Gregory Landue, earlier today. They are doing a similar thing with blockchain where they're essentially applying these ecological thresholds to specific agricultural and other instances using blockchain's capabilities for coming up with, call it, smart social contracts. So the last thing coming to an end shortly, this is a partnership that we are working with the Regenerative Communities Network that the Capital Institute has created. And we are actually just signed our partnership agreement with them. And essentially what they are looking at doing is working on a bioregional basis to transform economies from degenerative to regenerative economies on a bioregional basis, working with communities in those bioregions using these 8 different practices that you see in their cycle of engagement. So I'm not going to go into depth on that, but you have the resources listed there in the links. But that the Regenerative Communities Network is something to keep an eye on, and ideally that there would be work within the bioregions in Korea where you're located that would collaborate with this Regenerative Communities Network. Finally, the UNRISD paper that I mentioned earlier is coming out hopefully later this week, and it distinguishes between 3 tiers. The first tier is most of what we have nowadays for measuring so-called sustainability, and these are what I would call incrementalist. So it's just looking at the numerator of the sustainability quotient that I showed earlier. So it's just looking at the actual impacts and reducing the negative impacts. But it isn't applying what we call tier 2, which is where you start to integrate the thresholds. So what would those reductions in negative impacts need to be? What's the rate? What's the size of those impacts in order to be sustainable within the donut thresholds? And then finally, a third tier is a very emerging field of transformation indicators. And I would point you to the Blue Marble evaluation methodology. There's a book coming out this fall by Michael Quinn Patton that we will be focusing on in that paper, and it's referenced in that paper. So finally, this gets you to today, and the United Nations in this 2015 paper proposed the second bullet point here, a multilateral organization should collaborate to create a global governance body of scientists, academics, business practitioners, etc., to provide guidance on methodologies for determining ecological and social thresholds, as well as guidance on approaches to allocations, all of which are broadly applicable to the business level and beyond, I would say. So that brings you to today. As I mentioned, I'm in the Netherlands, and we are having our kickoff meeting for the Global Thresholds and Allocations Council. We've received funding for that, and this is kicking off a feasibility study that starts today, where we are essentially putting all of the puzzle pieces in place in order to launch this Global Thresholds and Allocations Council in June of this year. And so the mission of the Global Thresholds and Allocations Council will be to identify thresholds and norms for sustaining the carrying capacities of systems-level capital resources in the commons that are vital stakeholder well-being based on a comprehensive review of research and physical and social sciences, as well as practice in the field. So that's the threshold side of things. It also would either design, if they don't exist, or validate existing allocation methodologies that apportion fair share responsibility for jointly preserving and enriching capital resources that are vital to stakeholder well-being. And then finally, it would be really to get these practices out and in use. So disseminate these consensus-based thresholds, norms, and allocations with off-the-shelf ease of use in order to facilitate mainstreaming of this globally. So that's what I'm heading out after this presentation. I'm heading into our first meetings for that, so I'm very excited about that, and I would be glad to keep everyone there abreast of the developments. That brings me to the end of the formal presentation, but I have plenty of time, so thank you very much.
Neil, do you hear me?
Yes, I hear you.
Okay. We are so happy. And how many minutes do you have for questions and answers?
So I have a half an hour available, so I have plenty of time for questions and answers.
Okay, then I'll ask the audience to whether they have some answers for you. All right?
Great, thank you.
예, 저기 뭐 그 갑자기 그 통계 얘기가 회계 얘기가 나와서 조금 어리둥절하신 분도 있을지 모르겠는데 이 커먼스 문제에 있어서는 아주 중요합니다. 왜냐면은 우리가 지금 하고 있는 기업 회계라고 하는 거는 15세기에 틀이 잡혔는데 우주는 무한하고 그 안에서 우리 기업이 영원히 팽창할 수 있다라고 하는 게 그 철학적 기초입니다. 이 방식으로 회계를 하게 되면은 생태 문제, 지금 스레쇼홀드라고 표현했던 사회적 한계와 생태적 한계를 당연히 파괴하게 될 뿐만 아니라 커먼스가 원래 지향해야 될 올바른 방향으로 가는 데 있어가지고 이 기업 회계 이렇게 무한한 팽창을 요구한다는 게 절대로 양립할 수가 없습니다. 그래서 지금 이분이 지금 커먼스와 생태적인 것과 사회적인 것을 양립시키기, 서로 조화시키기 위한 획기적인 그 어떤 그 회계 방법을 개발하기 위해서 많은 노력을 하고 있고요. 아까 나왔던 책자 하나는 저희 P2P 파운데이션에서 나온 건데 저희 지식 공유지대에서 번역을 한국말로 번역해서 올려놓기로 했습니다.
Hello, Bill, and really glad to hear you. So it's not really a question, but I realize this is very abstract matters, and I just wanted to give you like a 2-minute context. So in my presentation in the beginning, I said, we are in a civilization which doesn't have the consciousness to take into account the environment. We just have a great difficulty of doing that, right? Now at the individual level, we can, connect with nature, create community. But as we live in a very complex society, we need to work also at how these people at the head of these big organizations see the world. And right now we have an accounting system which is blind to nature, right?
Yes.
Let's say capitalist accounting, which was invented in the 15th century, is simply what comes in, what comes out, and what I can accumulate within that. So it doesn't tell you anything about the natural environment. So basically,
right.
This is an effort at a high, complex, and abstract level of accounting systems for big corporations and regions and cities that they can start seeing directly the resources. Of course, it's not enough. There's a lot more need to change, but at least that as they manage our resource base, we start realizing these are trusts. You know what a trust is, right? It's not something that you can spend forever. There's so much copper in the world, and
right.
Once we use copper, when we reuse it, it's only 70%. So it has a shelf life, and so basically global thresholds allocation is that you have a group of scientists in the world which monitor the health of our resource base and tell everybody else this is what the world can use so that we keep this resource available for the next generations. And this should be really integrated into accounting. And what is great about Bill Baue's work and Reporting 3.0 is that right now what we're doing is financializing everything, right? So when we talk about taking into account natural resources, what they're actually doing is financializing the natural resource. And that makes us actually blind to the real natural resource. So this is called multi-capitalism. Maybe not the right word for me, but I just explain what they mean by it. You have to look at each capital on its own. So you have to know how much copper you can use independently of the financial value of the copper, right? So this is not an integrated in the sense that everything is financialized. It simply forces people who manage big systems to have to look at the resource base that they are using directly, not intermediated by money, which gives you a lot of fake information, but really look at the resource itself. And the good news, and I'm stopping now, is that technically, as you can see, this is becoming possible to do. So we're getting the tools that allow us to integrate this notion that we live in a limited material world, and that is actually not just normally available day to day in our accounting system, which becomes ecosystemic. So REA is about not am I doing well, but is this transaction, what is the place of this transaction in our collaborative ecosystem? This is a new form of accounting that doesn't have double entry. It's post-capitalist accounting. Anyway, I know it's abstract, but I think it's, to manage our complex systems, we do need this kind of complexity.
Yeah, thank you, Michel. And I agree with everything that you said there, and you said quite a bit. Starting back to the beginning of what you said, I think that the notion of the consciousness, collectively and individually having consciousness of what our impacts are, and whether those impacts are self-sustaining, is difficult. I mean, we do this on an individual level with our bank accounts. So the ideas that I presented are no more complex than the idea of making sure that there's more money coming in than is going out of our bank account. That's context-based thinking in a nutshell. Our accounting systems do not practice this, as you rightly point out, or they practice it to financial measures without taking into account that underlying finance are natural resources and human resources. And so that's the idea of multi-capitalism. Whether we call it capital or not, I'm agnostic. I don't care. It's just, the notion of capitals as the term for resources has gotten some traction. So we use that language, but it's really talking about resources. So you can call it capital, you can call it resources, what have you. The question of whether to monetize that, in our accounting system and in our economy, essentially monetization is the lingua franca, if you will. It's the language that is understood by the market. And so there is a push towards financialization or monetization. I personally think that that's ill-advised, but organizationally we're agnostic on the pros and cons of financialization, but we are very firm on the idea of if you are going to monetize, so if you're going to put a financial price on a resource, you have to do it within the sustainability of that resource. So this is what I'm showing here is what are called monetization cost curves. So this is basically looking at an ecological resource. The flow of that resource up to the 1.0 line is there's sufficient resource available to use on an ongoing basis. So if you're using the stock of something, the flow, you're working off of flows on the left of the line. On the right of the line, you're starting to dip into stocks of it. So from a bank account perspective, would be where you're dipping into your principal and you're no longer living off of your income, you're living off of your savings, so to speak. And we all know that there's only so long before you deplete your savings. So the idea of monetization cost curves is that you apply monetization up to the point where you are using up the resource and it's regenerative, the ability of that resource to regenerate itself. And then you make it financially unavailable at the point, and it becomes increasingly expensive. The resource becomes increasingly expensive as it reaches its threshold of availability. This is how supply and demand is supposed to work, but as we know, it doesn't take into account, for example, the limited resource of carbon absorption, for example. So the limited ability of our Earth to absorb the carbon and other greenhouse gases that we emit. So this is something that's been proposed by Mark McElroy. I'll just point to the next slide here. I may need to do that. So, and it's, just in the other direction, this is exactly the same thing that's contained in a report that came out in 2018 called The Wealth of Nature. They're saying exactly the same thing, that if you're going to put a price on a resource, that price has to take into account the sustainability threshold of that resource, and it has to make what they're calling in this paper critical natural capital unavailable to the marketplace. So you have to build your buffer into the system. And again, our accounting systems do not do this at all. So the point that Michelle started with, that we have to do fundamental social transformation of mindsets and paradigms of our accounting systems, that is paramount, and that's what we at R3.0 are doing when we propose an accounting blueprint, for example. And we look forward to that work gaining more attention.
Hi, Bill. It's Kirsten here from the Open Food Network. My question, I think maybe Michelle and you have answered a little bit, but I'm just curious. I've been doing work with people in Australia around particularly natural capital and core capitals, and I'm very excited to see what you're doing because it puts a framework around a lot of things I've been wondering and trying to push, which is very helpful. My question is, up to the point before you look at the thresholds and allocations, what's the relationship with the SIA, the UN SIA Environmental Accounting Framework? Are you using that as a standard that then you put thresholds and allocations on top of, or you see this as a completely separate kind of exercise?
Okay, thank you. And what was your name again?
It's Kirsten Larson from the Open Food Network.
Okay, great. Thank you for the question, Kirsten. One thing I would point to in your region of the world as a sort of beginnings of an answer is the work of Kate Meyer, who's a partner of ours with the Planetary Accounting Network, or PAN. She did her PhD dissertation on this and then transformed that into an organization that is a network of those in the accounting field who are applying a threshold, a Doughnut thresholds approach. And so she would be a quote-unquote local or more local resource. I think she's based in New Zealand, not Australia proper, but certainly in that region. But to the core of your question, essentially the approach that we're taking for thresholds and allocations would be agnostic of the methodology that's being applied. So it would be applicable to different accounting systems, and essentially what we're advocating for is creating methodologies that would be applicable broadly, or as you're pointing to, if there's a specific accounting system that needs a very specific implementation, then this council would be the body that would spur the development of that. They wouldn't necessarily develop it themselves, but one of the things that we're doing is tapping into the networks of researchers and developers who could do this. So, Kate's Planetary Accounting Network is one example of the networks that we're tapping into. Another would be the study that I showed with the bubbles was produced by Anders Bjorn, who's a Danish researcher. He's now based at Concordia University in Montreal, which actually is the home of the sibling institute, the 칼폴라니 Institute, directed by Margie Mandel, a colleague of mine with this UNRISD work at Concordia. So Anders Bjorn is now based at Concordia, and he has created a network of researchers who are applying planetary boundaries and other thresholds to life cycle assessment, or LCA, methodologies, and they've just put out a paper that I can share if you've got interest. I'm glad to share my contact information again on that. So I'm not familiar with the, and I don't think I maybe heard it clearly about the UN accounting mechanism that you mentioned, but the point here would be that what the Global Thresholds and Allocations Council creates would be applicable across different accounting systems.
Hi. First of all, thanks a lot for your in-depth research, because I never knew if there was such an academical approach to make somehow these comments way of living even to the corporate context. And I tried to read the P2P, the research thing with the orange color on the cover page before, but I didn't really, first of all, I couldn't really fully understand. I just read the chapter 1, and my question is, what is the benefit for the corporate to adapt these totally new way of accounting system?
That's a great question, and thank you for delving into the research. As I mentioned, all of our research is open source, so the blueprints that I mentioned earlier are downloaded from our website, and we are working on a new round of blueprints. So some of what we're talking about today will be contained in the sustainable finance blueprint that we're working on coming up, and then we're working on another one called value cycles. So it's basically looking at the question of value, and this is the beginnings of an answer to your question. The definition of value and the transformation of it from a linear throughput model of value creation to even going beyond the notion of a circular economy, which we believe there are. We embrace the idea of the circular economy that the Ellen MacArthur Foundation is advocating, and others. But we believe it actually should be cyclical, and there's a need to reconcile the work of the circular economy with the kinds of thermodynamic considerations that I mentioned earlier in the work of James Quilligan and the P2P Foundation's work on thermodynamics as well. And I can point you to resources that are pointing out this sort of gap, if you will, between circular economics and thermodynamic economics, if you will. But your question is really sort of, why should a company care about this? And I guess my primary answer would be, and let me see, oh, great. Essentially, there's a maturation of the notion of value that we are in the process of experiencing right now. And this is work that our friends at the Future Fit Business Benchmark have put together. This is an idea that Jeff Kendall, their CEO, came up with actually before he even started Future Fit. Right now, the doctrine of shareholder primacy called for identifying the value of a corporation in terms of the value that it generates for shareholders or investors broadly. So it's just looking at the financial value for a small subset of stakeholders, or what we would call rights holders, actually. We believe going further, we believe that all beings that are impacted by an organization have rights. They have rights to the resources that they rely on for their well-being. So they have rights to water, they have rights to food, they have rights to clean air to breathe, they have rights to a minimum level of compensation for their labor, for example. And none of that is addressed in the shareholder value notion. So as you can see, business is seen as separate from the environment and society. Michael Porter, the Harvard academic, has proposed the notion of shared value, which essentially says, really business should create value financially that doesn't harm society, or that somehow aligns with social and environmental benefit. But if there's environmental or social destruction, that's sort of unaddressed in the shared value notion of doing things. So what we advocate for is the notion of system value, so that the value that a company creates is wholly subsumed, or is wholly a part of the society that it exists within and the environment within which that society exists. And the point here is that a company that's just creating value for a subset of shareholders and doing so at the expense of the broader systems, society and the environment, that it can't do that forever. Those kinds of companies go out of existence, or the society that they exist within goes out of existence. So we are at a point where the risks that we are taking, the risks that individual organizations are addressing, have moved from the level of enterprise risk, or risk to the enterprise, risk to the organization, beyond that to portfolio risk, which is the risk to a portfolio of organizations from an investment perspective, that we're actually seeing what's now called systemic risk, where that risk is played out to entire systems. So that's a notion that emerged with the global financial crisis of 2008. Essentially, we are in the realm of systemic risk right now, where the global system of civilization is at risk right now. And so we are now into the realm of what's called existential risk. So we're now at the point where the impacts of companies and the value that they destroy is now having a systemic and even an existential impact. So just to unpack that, our very existence as human beings in a civilization, in a culture, is at risk. Civilizations collapse, ecosystems collapse. That happens in reality. And the collective impact of the businesses in this world are generating that risk. So what we're doing is we're trading off the idea of creating financial value for a small group of people. We're trading that off for the very ability for entire civilizations to exist. I don't know about you, but it sounds like a crazy trade-off to me. I would rather live in a world that looks at creating value not just for a small subset of people, but creates value for the entire system and does so in ways that are ongoing.
Okay, Bill, thanks very much for your answer. 그런 시간이 없어서 여기서 아마 마쳐야 될 것 같습니다. Thanks, Bill. We are running short of time, and thanks for joining us. And we're gonna get together soon and have some beer or something. Okay?
Great, that's great. I look forward to reaching the same point in the day a few hours later than you.
Okay, good luck to your presentation today.
Thank you very much, and have a great rest of your conference.